Hi, peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and author of 4 baking books, including Salty, Cheesy, Herby, Crispy, Snackable Bakes. On each episode, I hang out with the sweetest bakers around and take a deep dive into their signature bakes. Today's guest is Valerie Gordon. Valerie is the pastry chef and owner of Valerie Confections in Los Angeles and the author of the 2013 cookbook, Sweet. She got her start in the industry working at the Hollywood hotspot, Les Deux Cafés, and stayed there until it closed in 2004. That same year, she launched her luxury chocolate brand. Today, all sorts of chocolates, caramels, petits, and even cake and pies are on offer. Valerie and her team operate a boutique in Glendale and a cafe in Echo Park, as well as a robust online business. Valerie joins me to talk about her baking journey and her incredible career, including the fact that by 3rd grade, she'd already developed a serious, quote, baking habit. Then she walks me through her recipe for rose petal petits. They are the most impossibly charming, perfect little layer cakes, and I loved learning what goes into each component and how to assemble them. Chatting with Valerie was such a treat, so stay tuned for our convo. Listeners, please know that Valerie and I chatted before the devastating wildfires happened in LA. Thankfully, Valerie and her team are safe, and they've been doing various fundraising efforts for their city. I'm sending my love to everyone affected by these fires. Cherry Bomb's next issue is all about love, and I think you're going to love the cover. It features Ilona, Olivia, and Adriana Marr, the sister trio that has won everyone's hearts for their positive message of confidence and self-love. The issue is full of joyful stories and recipes. To snag a copy, head to cherrybomb.com or click the link in our show notes, or visit your favorite bookstore or culinary shop to pick up an issue. Let's chat with today's guest. Valerie! So excited to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to talk petit four with you and so much more. I love starting conversation with guests about early baking memories, and you have a plethora of amazing ones. Can you tell us about Gung Gung and Paw Paw and the lesson that Gung Gung taught you when you were 6, which arguably impacted your illustrious professional path?
It truly is my philosophical North Star. What I was taught was never go empty-handed, because we were going to visit his lawyer. This is my Chinese grandfather who didn't speak English, and my mother was the translator, which was often the relationship that happened. And for whatever reason, I was home from school, and they were bringing a box of See's chocolates.
Tell people who don't know about See's, because that's pretty special.
See's is my other North Star. It is the most, I think, and I don't mean to downgrade my work, I think it's the most important chocolate company in California. And if you were raised in California, you know See's chocolates. It is in a white box with black graphics. The nuts and chews are arguably the most celebrated collection of chocolate. And you walk into a See's and you get a sample. And there's nothing better than walking into a chocolate shop and getting a sample. So See's was my favorite growing up. Our family always had it. We were going off to Gung Gung's lawyer, and he had a box of See's chocolate. And there, my life's philosophy was gifted to me, which was never go empty-handed.
He said that to you when you asked him, why are we giving the lawyer See's?
He said it in Chinese, and my mother translated. I said, why are we bringing chocolate? Like, I was so jealous.
Right.
I was like, I want the chocolate. Right.
So you were not a kid with an easy bake oven. Instead, you were using grown-up equipment from the start, and by 3rd grade, you developed a serious baking habit. So please unpack all of this. This is like so exciting. What kinds of things were you baking, and where were you seeking inspiration?
I was baking things in our family kitchen. I was raised in the 70s. I'm 53 years old now, so this will shock people who are young parents in today's society. I was left home alone at age 7. I would take the bus home, and I had a key, but I was scared. I was scared being home alone. I really didn't like it very much, which is probably why we don't leave 7-year-olds home alone anymore. But anyways, back to baking. I loved food, and I loved going into bakeries, and I would always get that really visceral thrill from walking into a bakery where you would get that, that almost tingly, heart-filled sense of anticipation. And I always felt that around sweets and particularly in a bakery. And I found when I baked at home, I got that same feeling. I couldn't wait for something to get out of the oven. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It just like every moment was Christmas. And I realized as I was home alone that, I had already learned how to make chocolate chip cookies. That was my first kind of cookie, that I could just bake something. And by the time my baking project was done, other people were coming home. And then I could relax and feel joy. Then I got really addicted to it because I started bringing cookies to school. And I saw the reaction from people who received cookies that I passed to them from my desk. So,
were you also cooking dinner for the family? I feel like there was maybe baking and cooking going on.
I always cooked. Yes,
Yeah.
I always cooked. And I've always been sort of fearless around cooking. And I think in part it's because how I was raised. I was very much raised of if there's something you want to know, figure it out. And I did. And I read from a very young age. And my mom always had a few cookbooks. And I would just sit there and pour over the joy of cooking. And I would pour over whatever cookbook was there. I always made my own lunch from the time I was in kindergarten. And then I started doing family meals also. I learned how to make sushi when I was like 12 years old because I said to my mom, sushi's my favorite food. And she said, well, you better learn how to make it because I'm not buying you sushi every day. And so I did. I got a sushi book, took, what was it, the 43 bus over to the Japanese market, got the ingredients I wanted, went back home and learned how to make it all. That's just sort of how my whole culinary education has gone.
There were two bakeries that played
Yes.
like a big role in your childhood. Tell us about Fantasia, where I think it's fair to say you might have been introduced to Petit Fours.
Absolutely.
And then also tell us about Tasahara, which also impacted baking and making that you do today.
Huge. So Fantasia was this amazing bakery that was in Laurel Village, which is sort of on the edge of Pacific Heights in San Francisco. And the lead baker there was the baker from Blum's Bakery. So he then left Blum's Bakery, Ernest Weil was his name, and he opened Fantasia. At Fantasia, they had the most magnificent cakes. They had bags of cookies. They had all forms of confections, and they had Petit Fours, which I really was just so seduced and enraptured by these little 1-inch bites of beautifully covered cake. And I loved the decor on them, and I would just stare at them. And for whatever reason, they were something that my parents felt were too frivolous to purchase. Like there was some reason they were never purchased. And I just found them to be just like the most beautiful things in the world. And so I always wanted to taste a Petit Four, and I would just look at them every time we went there. And we would, for whatever reason, we would only get cookies or pastries or whatever, and never the Petit Fours. And then the Swiss Colony catalog came out. And Gen Xers who listen to this will know the Swiss Colony catalog. Starting in October, these commercials would air about the Swiss Colony catalog, and they were somewhat animated, and there was this very charming mouse that looked sort of like a Fievel, from that cartoon. And there were Petit Fours in the catalog, and one would come in the mail, and I would just go, one day I'm getting Petit Fours. And they were, again, these perfect little covered cakes that were in the catalog, and it was just embedded in my head. And it was something that I always looked at as like the penultimate of decadence, of enjoyment, like it's a chocolate but more because it has cake. Once I got older and I had my own money, I bought Petit Fours, and I was always sort of conflicted with them because I never found them as delicious as I wanted them to be. And so that became a big goal of mine.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Hi, everybody. It's Carrie Diamond, founder of Cherry Bomb and host of Radio Cherry Bomb. Have you dreamed of visiting Las Vegas? Join me and Team Cherry Bomb on Friday, March 7th and Saturday, March 8th for a special series of events in Vegas. We're hosting a fun party in the Arts District at the acclaimed Velveteen Rabbit Bar. Think terrific cocktails and mocktails, tarot card readings, I will be first in line for that, and the city's best food trucks. Then Saturday at the Wynn, we have a special networking breakfast and panel conversations with some of the women shaking up the culinary scene. Then Saturday night, there's dinner at the brand new Jelena at the Venetian. Tickets are on sale at cherrybomb.com right now. You can buy tickets to the individual events or a weekend pass. We'd love to see you there.
Peeps, have you heard about Cherry Bomb's Jubilee? It's our annual conference for women in food, drink, and hospitality, and it's happening Saturday, April 12th in New York City. I always love being at Jubilee and connecting with other bakers, pastry chefs, and cookbook authors. If you'd like to join us, you can get tickets at cherrybomb.com. If you're an official Bomb Squad member, check your inbox for special member pricing. I hope to see you there. Now back to our guest. Tell us about Tassajara.
Tassajara was the opposite of Fantasia. So Fantasia was in this pretty fancy neighborhood. Some fancy folks would go there. And Tassajara was in the Haight-Ashbury district. And it was 2 blocks away from my grammar school. And the Tassajara bread book is an iconic baking book. And they were, I think, a little culty at a certain point. But then, they baked. And so they were fabulous. And San Francisco in the 1970s really embraced all sorts of left-leaning boho-style lifestyles. And so the Tassajara Bakery was 2 blocks from my grammar school. And they had, I would say, like their dessert style was fairly similar to like a Chez Panisse dessert style in that era. And they had like a wonderful almond chocolate flourless cake with a chocolate glaze. But they had large rustic pastries. The bear claw, the palmier, their croissants. I can taste these things today. I can taste them. And it really showed me a different look, a different feel, a different approach to the world of pastry and dessert. And so between these 2 establishments, I was really getting like a nice breadth.
Also, you had me at the word large, because I love it when I go to a bakery and there's something big.
Oh, my God. That palmier was literally like 2 of my 8-year-old hands. You know what I mean? Just incredible.
Now, despite all this, you did not pursue going to culinary school or professional work in a kitchen for college or around those years or beyond, and instead you wanted to be an actor. Was the acting bug, and interestingly enough, so was I. I think there's a weird acting, baking phenomenon going on. But anyway, was the acting bug just stronger in you at that point in time? Or was it that there was no, like you couldn't even imagine that you could make pinafores as a job?
From the time I was very young, everyone would say, you need to open a bakery. You need to open a bakery. Valerie, you need to do this for a job. And I would always sort of bristle at the idea because it really was my safe space. It was the thing I did for absolute joy. And I just always had a fear that if it was my job, it would take away the joy. And acting, I've always had a fairly large personality, and I'm not super shy. In grammar school, I was also like the kid who gave speeches at the winter fair and things like that. And I would write my speeches, and I was really into being sort of a public-facing person. And what seemed natural was to get into acting because I liked being on stage. I liked speaking in front of people. I'd never felt fear around that. I felt very empowered in that medium.
You've said that your culinary school, as it were, was actually the years you spent working in restaurants, supporting your acting career, I assume. Tell us a little bit about that. One of your jobs was in the 90s at Les Deux Cafés. Tell us about what you were learning, because you weren't actually in the kitchen.
No. So I would say the most influential culinary experience, well, there was 2 actually. There was 2 great restaurants that I worked at in San Francisco. One was called Cava 555, and I was in college at the time. And I walked in the door, and it was this lovely little supper club in the south of Market. And I want to say I worked there in 93 and 94. This is how the economy was then. They served tête de cuvées by the glass. Hi. That doesn't happen anymore. Can you imagine? I mean, and tableside caviar and all of it. And I knew nothing. I knew nothing about wine and fine food and spirits. And that's what I mean by knowing nothing. And this was a huge thing in this teeny restaurant where I think the check average in 1993 was probably like $125. It was a lot. there was a sommelier there who quickly saw what was going on and just said, all right, well, Valerie, you're here. Let's go through this menu, and explained an aperitif and a digestif to me and talked through all different varietals of wine, and was such a great education. And the chef there was the same way, where at lineup, and I would just ask a lot of questions, because no matter what I do, and I'm sure you're the same way, I want to know as much as I can about it. You know, like, I don't want to be a dilettante in anything. I take things seriously, and I want to do the best that I can possibly do at everything. And it just really started opening up everything around food. And this is when a lot of chefs in San Francisco were really starting to get everything from the farmers market. And the Ferry Plaza Farmers Market was really becoming a thing. I left Cava and went to Lulu's, which was a very hot restaurant at the time. And I was there for 3 years and started as a lunch server. And by the time I left, I was the maitre d'. I really learned all the ins and outs of running a restaurant there, and all the customer engagement, all the service points, and I learned so much about food. I do look at that time as really establishing my approach to food, which is very much, I like things done very simply. I like to see the origin of, if you're doing a chocolate chip cookie, I want to see those chocolate chips. Like, there's so many forms of very esoteric ways of expressing a chocolate chip cookie. I like the tried and true done perfectly. Mm-hmm. That's how I approach everything. And that really was how the food at Lulu's was. You know, great pork loin on polenta, hot mussels on a skillet with drawn butter. So I really got into the food part of the restaurant there, but I also saw very clearly the huge pay difference between front of house and back of house there. And people would always say, Valerie, you bake all the time. And I would bring treats for people all the time. Why aren't you in the pastry department? I'd be like, no way. I knew that I made more than double what the people in the pastry department made, which was a problem. I knew it.
Yeah.
And from there, I moved to Los Angeles and immediately was the manager for Les Deux, which again was just this amazing place that couldn't exist today. This is a pre-social media kind of establishment where we had private events for Madonna, Lenny Kravitz. Joni Mitchell used to get up on stage impromptu and perform in the cabaret bar. It was an exceptional place run by an exceptional human who's Michelle Lamy, who is now, my God, she's like such a fashion icon. It's wild. So these back-to-back experiences, and I really dug in at both places too. I was at Les Deux for 5 years, and I was with the Lulu world for 3 years. It really gave me foundational education to create something unique and exciting, and to create something of quality.
Can you describe your dessert style? I know you've said that you're a self-taught home baker, and you don't consider yourself a chef. Tell us about sort of that hybrid dessert style or perspective on sweets, which I think evolved from sort of window shopping or bakery case gazing at Fantasia and Tassajara.
Our first tagline for Valerie Confections was for gifts and personal indulgence. I think that still stands true. I think you can gift yourself or gift someone else. I do believe that an excellent dessert, or for that matter, an excellent bite of any food, can really change the course of your day. I'm highly idealistic around food and particularly dessert, because dessert is a treat, right? Is it necessary for a livelihood as far as nutrition goes? No, it's not. And so when you get a lovely box of chocolate, it needs to be beautiful and perfect and delicious. And the visual and the taste have to be in alignment in order for that glorious sense memory to be embedded.
So now I want to talk about Petits. Can you first just describe them for people in case people are a little unsure of what a Petits is?
Sure. So the name is French, and what it references is little oven, because in the olden days, when these huge brick ovens were being used, there would be residual heat at the end of the bake. And little treats were made in there, and that's where the term Petits comes from. And Petits might mean a bunch of little bites of things. Whereas in America, how that has translated are little layer cakes that are coated. And they're generally coated in a fondant or a marzipan or a variety of different coatings. And they're fairly shelf stable. They frequently have a genoise cake, a little layer of jam, again, more marzipan, and they tend to be very small. They're intended to be 1 to 2 bites, and that's it.
So interesting. Okay. In about 2006, you sort of began an 8-month Petit testing journey. You wanted to put your signature on what you sort of had eaten when you were little at Fantasia, those tiny cakes that you were not permitted to purchase. At the time that you wrote your book, Sweet, these were the most popular items at Valerie's Confections. Is that still true today?
Today, it's probably all pretty even between our chocolates, our chocolate bars, our Petits. I think it's all pretty even. Yep. Something happened in 2011 that really jettisoned the Petits in a crazy way. It was mid-2006 when I started the Petit journey, and it took almost a year. And I was also pregnant with our first child at the time. And I always say in 2007, I birthed August and Petits because it was the longest development process I've ever done.
Well, they're truly incredible. I was lucky enough to eat one that Valerie brought me. So first things first, we're going to make the vanilla bean cake. So we're going to position a rack in the center of the oven. We're going to heat it to 350 degrees. We're going to grease the bottoms and sides of 3 9 by 13-inch pans. I assume there's probably Restaurant Supply at work, but is there a brand of pan that you are particularly fond of?
Sheet pans, we just use basic Restaurant Supply. Yeah.
So we're going to grease the bottom and sides of these 3 pans with nonstick baking spray or butter. Do you have a preference in the bakery, spray or butter?
We use spray and parchment.
Yeah.
We double it
I was getting to the parchment part. Yeah. Because of my bakery training, and I did air quotes, peeps, I use spray too. And you're going to line the bottoms with the parchment, but you don't make a sling. Like you're not trying to be, where you can have the parchment sort of come up the 2 long sides of the pan and then you can lift out the cake. You guys are just covering the bottom.
We actually do now because we use different pans that are exactly 12 by 12 that fit a guitar. So it's all changed a little bit.
I understand.
So now we have a sling that we use at that time 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And this was also for a home baker, the way I changed this. But no, we didn't because it lifts out very easily.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. So we're going to sift some all-purpose flour, some baking powder, some salt. And I had a couple of questions. First of all, is it kosher salt? Is it regular salt?
Kosher salt.
Kosher salt.
It's Morton's.
And I wondered about the sifting because often people think, unless it's cake flour, we don't need to sift. How come you like to sift for this?
It distributes the ingredients better.
And now we're going to sift the flour, the baking powder, the salt into a medium bowl. I assume at work you're probably using metal. Do you ever use glass? What's your bowl?
All metal.
All metal.
Stacks and stacks of stainless steel bowls.
Yep. Yes. So we'll set aside our dry ingredients and then in the bowl of a stand mixer with a paddle attachment, or you can use a large bowl and a handheld mixer. We're going to cream softened unsalted butter and some corn syrup and sugar. I loved reading about why you're using corn syrup. I thought it was so interesting. So can you tell us why you like to put a little bit of corn syrup in this cake?
It keeps it moist. And to me, moist cake is very important. I think I'm always on a journey to figure out how do we keep cake moist for as long as possible? What adjustments to ingredients can we do for that? Because, again, it's a treat. And there's something really sad about taking a bite of dry cake.
I think it's also really interesting because I will often make cakes with oil because they tend to be moist and they last longer on the counter. But this is sort of a nice, almost like a hack. Like you can use the butter, but if you add a little bit of corn syrup, you kind of almost get that shelf life and that moistness from the corn syrup that you usually would get with oil. I love that.
Additionally, the Petit cake is extremely thin. It's extremely thin. And so adding that little bit of corn syrup gives you sort of a crutch, if you will, in case you leave it in a minute or two too long.
And the sugar that we're mixing together right now, is that granulated?
It is.
So then on medium speed, we're going to mix together the butter, the corn syrup, and the sugar until light and fluffy, about 4 minutes. Then we're going to whisk together some eggs, some creme fraiche. I know we can substitute sour cream if we want, but what about creme fraiche? What's that contributing to this cake?
Creme fraiche has more fat than sour cream, and fat is very important to a delicious cake.
Fat equals flavor. So we're going to whisk together the eggs, the creme fraiche, some vanilla paste as well as vanilla. 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
What brand is your favorite of vanilla paste and vanilla? And also, why are we using both?
Tahitian Gold is my favorite brand of vanilla paste and vanilla extract. So there's a couple reasons why we use both. I am such a fan of vanilla paste, and I use it over and over and over in many recipes because I love a true vanilla flavor. And I love seeing those little specks of vanilla bean in something that is vanilla flavored, and it really tastes like the interior of a vanilla bean pod. It really does. And I just love it. And I love how it just sort of floats in that little sugar base. It's so great. And then you've got vanilla extract. So there's 2 things happening here. One is a cost issue because vanilla paste is extremely expensive. All vanilla is crazy expensive, but vanilla paste is particularly expensive. And vanilla extract also has a lot of alcohol in it. And the vanilla paste doesn't really. It's more of a sugar syrup that it's floating in. And so I found by using both, again, that alcohol keeps the cake nice and moist. This cake batter is quite dense. And so adding the liquid of the vanilla extract into this cake makes it a little more spreadable. And then that evaporates while it's baking. And vanilla paste, it was a cost thing and also a texture thing.
We're going to whisk together the eggs, the creme fraiche, the vanilla paste together, and then we're going to add that mixture into the creamed butter mixture. I thought this was interesting. Why are we mixing our eggs with our liquid ingredient or our creme fraiche rather than often in a cake recipe, you'll beat the sugar and the butter together and then the next step is to add the eggs? How come you're adding the eggs with the creme fraiche and adding that all together?
I don't know. I've never really thought about that, honestly.
Do you ever make cakes where you add the eggs separately?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Frequently.
Yeah.
I just found it because then you've really got your wet and your dry.
Mm-hmm.
And because, again, this is a dense cake. So going back and forth
Mm-hmm.
in it is sort of easier.
Mm-hmm.
And you get that full emulsion. That's really nice.
We're going to scrape the bottom and sides of the bowl and the paddle, mix for 30 seconds. And then on low speed, we're going to add our dry ingredients in 3 batches, mixing for 30 seconds after each addition. And I also thought this was interesting because often you'll add those eggs along with your sugar and your butter. Then you'll have your dry and whatever your liquid is, and you'll do each one at a time. I kind of loved this. Like we don't
Go.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then we'll scrape the bowl again and mix for 15 seconds. And now we're going to spread the batter evenly between the 3 prepared cake pans. And as you've said, it's going to be very thin because essentially this is like a cake batter for like a single 9-inch cake. And we're putting it between 3 larger pans. Love that. So we'll bake for 7 minutes. We'll rotate our cakes, bake for an additional 3 to 4 until the cake appears firm, has a matte finish. Toothpick comes out clean. So we don't want moist crumbs here. Sometimes I always think if I don't want a dry cake, because I am like you, there's nothing worse than dry cake, I always want to see a moist crumb because I'm worried otherwise I've overbaked. But here probably because it's so thin.
It's so thin.
Yep.
And one other thing that's very important for listeners who choose to go down the path of the petit four, it's really, really important to not have any butter chunks in your batter. And that's why the instruction is to scrape, beat over and over and over. Because if you have any butter chunks, that results in a butter blast in the batter where it can create holes in the cake if you see little chunks of butter. So you really have to make sure that batter is completely smooth.
So now we're going to let the cakes cool completely in the pans on a cooling rack for 30 minutes, and then we're going to put them in the fridge for 30 minutes because cold cake is essential for building petit fours. Question, why aren't we releasing them from the pans and letting them cool that way? Why do you keep them in the pans?
So this was something that came about. We do move them in our kitchen. With my recipe tester, she had a lot of fear about moving that extremely thin, hot cake. And I was like, right, of course. So it's about giving people confidence and knowing that cake is set, because that is sad to do it and then, oh my God, it tears. And then you've got to start over and then you don't have enough butter and then you just pour a glass of wine and call it. So that's why. It's to make sure that the cake is really set up and it's easier to move.
So now we're going to make the passion fruit ganache. So we're going to sprinkle some powdered gelatin. Is there a brand of gelatin?
Knox.
We're going to sprinkle powdered gelatin over cold water in a small bowl. Let it set for 10 minutes until the gelatin softens. Why are we adding gelatin to our ganache?
Okay, we are adding gelatin to the ganache so that it's firmer. Because as we move along this and we get to the coating, we really need to make sure that that ganache is super stable and that it's not sort of pulling as you cut your layers, that it really is straight up and down and holds firm.
So we're going to put some, it could be white chocolate chips, it could be fève, it could be a bar. We're going to put our white chocolate into a medium bowl, and then we're going to heat some creme fraiche. And I loved this, but I wanted to ask about it. Why are we putting creme fraiche as well as heavy cream in our ganache?
Again, it's
the fat.
It's the flavor and the fat.
Fat for
and
the
glory.
So we're going to heat our creme fraiche, and we can sub sour cream if we need to, some heavy cream, some passion fruit puree, and light corn syrup. Here in the ganache, it's for sort of silkiness and pliability. And we're going to bring that all just until it boils in a small saucepan. We'll remove from the heat. We'll stir in our gelatin until completely dissolved. And then we're going to pour over the chocolate and let it sit for about 1 minute. We'll use a small rubber spatula. Is there a brand, or is it just sort of a...
I love heat-proof silicone tools. I love them so much. GIR is a company that I really like, GIR.
Yes.
I love their whisks. I love their spatulas. I love their long, skinny spatulas. I know. Jesse's mouth is open with glee right now. Well, it's like it's an ecstatic tool.
Oh, my God. All the mini one, their mini whisk, their mini spatula, heaven.
Thrilling.
I know. So we're using our small rubber spatula that we adore, and we're going to begin stirring our ganache in one direction, concentrating on the center until smooth and glistening. So, first of all, why one direction? And second of all, why are we concentrating on the center?
Because essentially, the way any chocolate functions, I always equate it to how a magnet works. You take a magnet and then things are attracted to it. It starts off with one or two little pieces of metal, and then it just goes brrrr, and everything else gets attracted to the magnet. That's how chocolate is. When you're dealing with creating a ganache and dealing with that emulsification, if you get the scent, it's really almost like a little tornado that you're creating inside of your bowl with your spatula, and you want to stir really, really quickly until it glistens like a pudding or a frosting, and then everything else will start to come together. I find like if you just say stir, if you watch someone who is a novice in the kitchen or a new home baker or something, they'll just stir in sort of a random way and not in an ordered fashion. And so they're not going to get the same distribution of ingredient. And particularly when you're making a ganache, you want to do that focus in the center so everything else responds in that magnet-like way so it all comes together. Because we're dealing with heat. Ganache, if you don't move quickly, it won't come together. You are pushing that chocolate, that cream, that butter to create one wonderful, smooth, textured medium. And so that's what that does. But I always think of a magnet. So you want one nail to attach, and then the rest of the nails are going to come to the magnet.
And so I totally, that makes perfect sense about starting in the center. And then that one direction is more like a tip for the home baker. Like we're not talking about a willy-nilly stirring situation. You don't go to the left and then change your mind.
If you take an immersion blender, we're creating a manual immersion blender by doing that.
Now we're going to add softened, unsalted butter, and we're going to stir that in until it's completely melted, about 1 minute. And now we're going to add crushed, dried rose petals, and we're going to stir until those are evenly distributed. And I had a couple of questions about that. Do the petals, and I think I now know the answer because I've tasted it, but are the petals aren't adding anything textural? It's not a crunch, it's a flavor.
It's a flavor, and it's also optics. Because like the vanilla bean, where I want to see those little dots of vanilla, with rose, when you bite into the petifor and you see those little specks of dried rose petals, you see these are natural ingredients, that this is, there's real heart to that, I think, where you connect the origin ingredient.
I love that.
Yeah.
And where do you buy them? And is there a brand?
They're all over.
Okay.
I mean, any baking supply store has dried rose petals. A lot of tea companies And spice companies also have dried rose petals. Any Persian store is going to have rose petals also.
Now we're going to place the ganache in the coolest part of our kitchen. We'll let it set, stirring it occasionally until spreadable, about an hour before we're going to be able to use it. And now we're going to assemble our petit fours. We'll take our cakes out of the refrigerator. We're going to run a knife around the sides of the cake pans, and we're going to invert the cold cakes onto cooling racks. Then we're going to take one of the pans that we just used. We'll wash that, dry that, and then paper it. But we're not greasing it. We're just papering the bottom. We're going to lay one cake layer top side down into that pan we just prepped. Now, I'm assuming top side down because the bottom is flatter and we want that flat surface. And then we're going to peel off our parchment. Using an offset spatula, we're going to spread about 1 cup of the ganache evenly over the surface. So is there a brand of offset that you like? And are we using a small one at this point?
I love a small tool.
Me too.
Same way. I love a small bite. So I generally use, as other people like, a medium-sized spat, and some people will do just, getting it sort of to all 4 corners of the baking sheet, and then you finesse it with a small one. I think Wilton has really good offset spatulas, but, to all the bakers out there, you need all those offsets.
Then we're going to top with the second layer of cake, top side down, peel off the parchment, spread with the remaining ganache. Then we're going to top with the third cake layer, top side down. We're not removing the parchment from this one. And we are going to grab a heavy rolling pin, and we are going to roll over that top cake. What type of rolling pin do you like?
I'm a handle person.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I'm a handle person.
Okay.
And we have all different weights in our kitchen, for sure, for different sized projects.
And then a question, should we picture those 3 layers with 2 layers of ganache inside? They're in our 9 by 13 inch pan. Is the top layer kind of above the
It's peaky toe at that point.
And that's why we're doing the rolling pin, because we want it flat with the surface of the pan.
And you also just want it even.
Yeah.
You want it even.
I was worried that we had to have a tiny rolling pin inside the pan. But
No.
Basically, we're bringing the cake down to the top.
What you're doing is evening out the ganache layers. What you're also doing is removing any air pockets that might exist. That's really the main thing, because you want those layers to really adhere pretty much. And you'll notice, like in a lot of French pastry, there's a lot of simple syrup use, and there's none here. You're just going ganache cake, ganache cake, ganache cake, right? And so even if you're a very, very well-trained person with that offset spatula and your layers are super straight, there's still going to be a little bit of imperfection. So that pressure on the top sort of weights the entire thing so it evens out. And then you get nice, even layers of ganache between the layers of cake.
So now we're going to wrap the pan in plastic wrap, and we're going to freeze it for about 3 hours until it's frozen solid. I feel this so much in so many different kinds of recipes, usually more complicated ones, but it's so important to take advantage of your refrigerator and your freezer at different stages. Like, these are not things we skip. I'm very impatient, so I understand the desire to skip, but I also understand, really learning about this recipe from you, how much easier it will be for you when it comes time to slice and dip if this is very cold.
Yeah.
So now we're going to coat the petit fours. We're going to line a baking sheet with parchment paper. We're going to unwrap our baking pan. We're going to invert the cake onto a cutting board. So when we're inverting, are we going to pop it out and then pop it back up? You know how you can invert a cake so then the bottom of it is the top, or you can then move it again so the top is the top?
It doesn't matter that much
Great.
with this. Yeah.
Great.
It's pretty even.
So our cake is on our cutting board. We're using a ruler to score the top of the cake, and we want 35 squares or 24 squares out of a... It might not
Probably
be
35.
Yeah, it might not be a relevant question because I know you guys are using a much larger pan. But let's say a home baker was doing it in a 9 by 13 pan. I'm thinking 35.
Yeah.
Using a ruler, is there a type? Is there a brand? Is it like a kitchen ruler?
It's a culinary ruler.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what are those like? I feel I don't
They're
know.
metal.
Okay.
They're always metal,
Oh,
and
I
they
know,
go
I
down
remember.
to the millimeter.
Yep,
Yeah.
I remember. I use at home, I don't even know how I have these, but these tiny little measuring tapes. So we're going to score the cake into about 35 1-inch squares, and then we're going to use a sharp chef's knife, not a serrated knife, to follow those score marks and cut out our squares. Place our petit fours on our lined baking sheet. And I assume even though it's frozen, you can still get your knife through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's quickly defrosting
Yes.
as you're there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to follow our score marks to cut into squares, place our petit fours on a lined baking sheet, and we're going to refrigerate. Are we just refrigerating long enough for us to make the coating, or is this another long period of time in the fridge?
It's not a very long period of time. It's just to keep it cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we're going to stir some neutral oil. So I wondered if there's a type or a brand.
I really like, when I wrote this, I talked about grapeseed oil, canola oil, which folks really are not into canola oil anymore, right? There is this really great algae oil that's out now that's really interesting. And it really is completely neutral. It gives off no flavor at all. And it heats up really nicely. It's good stuff.
Ooh, it's funny, a lot of guests have talked about grapeseed oil, but no one has mentioned algae.
Yeah, it's really, really good.
Love that. So we're going to stir a neutral oil into some 31% white tempered chocolate. And it's funny, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't realize white chocolate had percentages.
Yeah.
Until it's fully incorporated, no streaks. And we're using the oil. I thought this was interesting because the oil will thin the chocolate, which will make it easier to dip. Can you give us like a quick tempering tutorial, like any tips or just a little bit of troubleshooting? I realize we've never talked about it really on the podcast. And I read sort of your instructions for doing so. And you made it seem easy.
Yeah, I never talk about science when I talk about tempering chocolate because it freaks people out. So in general, when you're tempering chocolate, you are replicating the origin state of the chocolate. So say you have a white chocolate bar. All you're doing is you're melting it and you're making it into another shape. And if you think about it like that, it makes sense. So likewise, say you have an ice cube in your freezer and you want to make a circle ice cube. What do you have to do to that? You've got to melt it and pour that melted material into a different mold to change the shape. That's really all you're doing when you temper chocolate. And we're not talking about bean to bar and all of that conching business. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about, so say you've got 1 pound of chocolate. You want to melt down 3/4 of the weight of the chocolate. That's it. You melt it down, and with white chocolate, you'll use your trusty thermometer, which also every baker needs a good digital thermometer, and you want to take that to 114 degrees. And then the 25% that you held on to, you slowly add that in, and you stir, stir, stir. And that 25% will speak in modern times. That's your influencer. Everything in that bowl wants to be like the influencer. It wants to take on all the attributes of the influencer. So you break up little pieces and you stir, stir, stir until everything's molten. And you take your trusty digital thermometer. And once you've gotten that to about 90 degrees, 89, 90 degrees, you're pretty much tempered.
Incredible. That was
so easy.
Brilliant.
So constant movement, and all you're doing is reshaping it. That's all you're doing.
Honey, you're a genius. So now we're going to remove the petit fours from the refrigerator. We're going to place the baking pan that the petit fours are on next to a bowl of our tempered chocolate. And we're using dipping forks. I know you say we need 2. What is a dipping fork?
So a chocolate dipping fork, they're really thin and they have long prongs. So dipping forks generally have 2 or 3 prongs and they're longer. And essentially they're so you can rest something on top of that fork, submerge it into a liquid fondant or a molten tempered chocolate and pull it out. That's what they're for. And they're very, very thin. If you were to use a normal fork, right, it's a little cumbersome. They're not flat. So all dipping forks are flat. So you can slide something off of it really nicely. There's no like circular shape to the tongs on the fork, which would keep it from falling off, right? Because we want the opposite with a fork that we use at dinner. We want food to hang on to that. With a dipping fork, ultimately you want it to easily slide off. So it's very thin and very flat.
And we do need 2 for this?
You do.
So what should I picture? We have 1 underneath our petit four that we're putting into the...
Yep. Okay. I'm going to talk you through this. I'm right-handed, so I pick up 1 undipped petit four and I'm pantomiming in the studio because I've done hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these by hand. So you take 1 uncovered petit four and you place it on your left fork. And then you use your right fork as a support to the left fork, and you submerge the entire petit four into the chocolate. You lift it out, and then you let it rest on your left fork. You take the right and you tap, 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 tap. What does that do? That is essentially a manual vibrating table. You'll see the chocolate start to pour down the sides and become an even coating on the sides of the petit four. And then you continue holding that petit four. You're balancing it on the left fork. You take your right fork, you rotate it horizontally so you can scrape the excess off the bottom. Then you transfer that petit four onto your right fork and slide it onto a parchment-covered sheet pan. And again, I am right-handed, so I'm going in that orientation, whereas a left-handed person would work opposite.
When you do your tap, you're tapping one fork on the other fork.
Yes,
you're not tapping your little cake.
Correct.
Okay.
You're tapping, and the point is to make that liquid
Excess
state chocolate fall off so it's not too thick.
So we'll use our 2 dipping forks. We'll do everything that Valerie just said. We'll dip one petit four into the chocolate, shake off the excess chocolate, place back on the parchment-lined baking sheet. And I also read this, which I thought was a really great tip. You really want this coating to be smooth. So you kind of need to almost get down, bend down, and at eye level, look at the top of your petit fours to make sure that everything is smooth. Now we're going to top with candied rose petals. These are going to be uniform organic rose petals. We're going to use either a small brush or our fingertips to brush a little egg white on each side. Then we'll sprinkle each side with sugar and let them set. That's how we would make them.
So you take a rose petal, and we generally trim them actually so they fit perfectly onto the petit four. And what you do is you want to make sure that you've completely coated both sides of the rose petal very thinly in egg white. And then you drop it into a bowl of sugar, and you want to make sure that again, you're completely covered. Essentially, you're fossilizing that rose petal. It's amazing. They last for a really long time. And you can do the same thing with mint, with basil. You can do this with any herb.
And then you let them set, obviously, before you place them on your petit four. But we are going to take one that's already been set, and we're going to place it on top of our petit four. Okay. Now, how long do we have to wait to eat them? Once you place that rose petal?
Until the chocolate is set, firm. 5 minutes.
You gave me a delicious petit four today. It was not cold because I hate cold cake. Do you keep them cold until you serve them?
Yes.
Okay.
So we ship them with a coolant pack, a gel pack. We keep them refrigerated at our locations. That's a preservation thing. They last longer if they're refrigerated. I do think they are best enjoyed at room temperature, because they're a little too rigid when they're cold. So we always say, let it sit out for a half hour, 45 minutes, then eat it.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Valerie. And I just want to say that you are my cherry pie.
You're mine, Jessie.
That's it for today's show. Don't forget to follow She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And tell your pals about us. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. Thank you to Good Studio in Brooklyn. Our producers are Carrie Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Jenna Sadu. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking!